Well, welcome everybody to the RTI Toolbox Series. My name is Tyler Nelson. I am the training director for RTI. And today we're going to be focusing on the communication method Zigbee as the primary communication method between RTI, handheld controllers, and the XP control processors. And this communication method allows the remotes and the processor to talk to each other to be able to provide those direct macro trigger signals and receive feedback information. And it really is a very reliable way to communicate between these two devices, especially when set up correctly. Today, what I want to cover is go over some key topics. And upon completing this course, I want to make sure that you all have the knowledge, including understanding what the basis of the Zigbee communication protocol is and how it pertains to RTI, the proper setup and programming method, and then being able to take a look at that and judge the signal quality and being able to make the necessary adjustments and what needs to happen in those adjustments in order to create a successful installation for your client. As always, we will be recording this training session or this webinar, and I will edit it and post it and send out the link in case anybody or any of your employees would like to watch it after we are completed here today. If you do have questions, as I mentioned before, please put them in the question section of the software, and I will answer them at the end of the presentation. When we start talking about Zigbee, what is Zigbee? Zigbee is an IEEE 802.15.4 based specification for a suite of high-level communication protocols used to create personal area networks between devices. And this allows those devices to communicate in two-way fashion. Because it's IEEE, we can send signals and we can receive them to a certain amount of data transfer capabilities. There are three different devices, or three classes of types of the Zigbee devices available for you. There's the Zigbee coordinators, or otherwise called parents, the Zigbee routers or extenders, and then the Zigbee end devices, or the children. Now, with Zigbee itself and how it pertains to RTI, RTI does use a proprietary Zigbee signal between the XP processors and the remote controls. This signal uses a low-power 128-bit encryption network key that allows for a very fast but very secure response and communication method. It is also set on one of 16 channels and uses CSMA, otherwise known as Carrier Sense Multiple Access. And all this is done at a 2.4 gigahertz frequency. This allows the ability of that two-way communication to take place between the Zigbee transceivers built into or connected to the devices. This entire feature combination also provides accurate signal transmission with minimal interference with any other Zigbee items that may be in the project. In terms of RTI, we talked about the three types of Zigbee device classifications that there are, with the Zigbee coordinators, the routers, and the end devices, the parent, the router, and then the child. But how does that pertain to the RTI standpoint and how it's set up in our program files? Well, the Zigbee coordinators are typically going to be the XP processors that have that connected transceiver, whether it's the XP3, KX4, or even the XP6S, XP8V with those ZM24s. The Zigbee routers can typically be a ZM24, which is set up as a repeater and range extender, but it can also be but you can also utilize a processor as an expansion processor with that connected ZM with that transceiver as a range extender as well. So just keep that in mind. You do have those options. In addition to all this, you can have multiple coordinators in a project. Simply stated, you could have its standard main processor and then a expansion processor and utilize the Zigbee communication on that processor, say an XP3, and within Integration Designer, create a secondary parent network with it by utilizing that expansion processor. And we have lots of material on how exactly to do that on the website. And then the Zigbee end devices or the children, as they're otherwise known, are the remotes. So you've got the parents, which are the main processor with the connected transceiver, and then the children, which are the remotes, with the routers in between to separate that distance if necessary. Now, It is important, however, that when you are working with Zigbee, you understand the limitations as well of that technology in order to best serve your clients and be able to put those projects together that work very, very well. Our proprietary Zigbee signal allows us to add up to 16 end device RTI remotes to communicate with a single coordinator parent transceiver. In other words, you have 16 T2Xs in a job that can communicate, if within range, of that single ZM24 parent, if necessary. Now, if adding additional transceivers as routers and range extenders doesn't increase this number, since the end devices are going to be communicating directly with that parent Zigbee. If you need more Zigbee end devices, you can add additional expansion processors and create secondary Zigbee networks, as I explained before. But it's important to understand that that 16 end device remotes per parent is the limitation on that. The other part that is very important and sometimes confused with Zigbee is that it does not allow for roaming capabilities. And that's a technological thing. That's not just an RTI thing. Now, this means that if you create a Zigbee network with multiple repeaters or additional separate parent networks, the remote isn't just going to jump to the closest transceiver that it finds within range. It doesn't constantly scan for another extender or another network. It is tied to that initial parent upon programming. Now, there are detailed instructions on how to initiate the communication change to the new transceiver within the user manual on the rticontrol.com. So keep that in mind as you're going through and setting up your project. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like here in just a second. But it is important to understand some of those limitations of the technology. Let's move on to the setup and programming. Now that you've got an idea of what the technology can do, we can go through the proper setup and programming of what this process looks like. But before we do that, let's take a brief look at the RTI Zigbee devices so you have an understanding of what those products look like in putting together your projects and jobs. In terms of the processors, the XP3 has a built-in transceiver. The XP6 and S and 8V both need a ZM24 transceiver connected to it, to the RTI COM port. The KX4, the all-in-one touch panel, does have a built-in transceiver, and the VXP82 incredible collaboration device does have the RTI COM port on it, for which the ZM24 transceiver can be connected to it. Well, those on the processor side. On the remote side, well, it's the entire lineup. They all have the capability of that Zigbee communication. Now, keep in mind that there are some that are not going to provide feedback, such as the Surfer, or you may have to select one or the other in terms of one-way communication or two-way communication, depending on the situation. But all the remotes do have the Zigbee capabilities. The RTI Zigbee devices, in terms of touch panels, transceivers, and the tools you need, include a KX4, as we mentioned before, that can act as not just a coordinator and a parent in the network, but also as a Zigbee extender, or even as a secondary network if necessary. The ZM24 is going to be the transceiver that we utilize in our projects to connect to the processor to create those parent Zigbee networks, or used as a jump point in the expansion network. And the ZB Pro is the dealer tool you need in order to make sure that you can configure those ZM24s as those network routers and extenders. And if you were going to be setting up the U3 remote, you do need to have the ZB Pro in order to program it. So do keep that in mind in terms of the devices. The ZB Pro, if you don't have one, make sure to get one today. All right, so we've got an idea of the products. We've got an idea of what the technology can do. In terms of setting up the project and understanding the placement, when we look at a project itself and designing a project, it's best to understand how placement plays a critical part to the success of a client installation. Typically, you'll want a central position of the project for the parent Zigbee coordinator in order to cover as much area as possible. And generally speaking, if you think about where that might be, if this is where the main that main processor might be for whatever reason, we're going to try and put that Zigbee coordinator, the parent coordinator, in a central location to grab that area. But there are things that you need to keep in mind. First of which being, make sure to check for interference items that may limit that coverage range. And that's just visual, folks. This can include things like HVAC units. It can include things like when we're talking about HVAC units or furnaces, or we're talking about appliances, or even if there's, let's say, metal studs in the wall, it's important to know this information, just as it is with when putting together a network, a Wi-Fi based network, because of that possibility of reducing the overall coverage that you can get from that signal. After you've taken a look and you've determined that, yes, this is probably going to be the best place for this parent device, then you can test that Zigbee network with the Zigbee network counter. And we'll talk a little bit more about this and how that Zigbee network test bundle works in just a moment. But just as a little tool of the trade, if you will, the XP3 and the T2X, if you have a couple of those in hand for, just to keep on hand and to use as your test bed, it's a very easy way to not have to drag a ton of equipment in and be able to utilize that Zigbee network test driver as a way to test where that range is going to be. Okay, so just keep that in mind. And we'll show you how to use the Zigbee network test driver in just a moment. So once we've established that this is going to be the best place for this, and we know that this is going to be the approximate range based on that counter and the Zigbee network test, we can decide that parent Zigbee network doesn't quite reach the necessary areas. So if we're going to be adding additional Zigbee routers into the mix, or repeaters, it is necessary to reach those areas. We're going to need to utilize that Zigbee Pro, as I mentioned before. And by utilizing that Zigbee Pro and plugging in the Zigbee transceiver, we can communicate and configure those ZM24 Zigbee transceivers to act as those extenders, those jump points. And what they'll allow us to do is to be able to expand that network and be able to easily add in those additional controllers for the rooms as necessary. And this ZM24 will essentially act as a jump point. So the T4X is going to communicate with this ZM24. It's going to jump that signal and then communicate right to the main processor. Same thing for the T1B Plus. Whereas the T2X over here, well, that's going to communicate directly with this guy right here. Once again, it is important to know that when you are configuring these and setting them up in Integration Designer, you will want to make sure that when you do turn these on, or when you send the programming, that they are closer to the area of that ZM24 that you would like it to communicate with initially, so that it lines up with it and it can talk to it. Once you have that all set up and done, the other couple of things that I want to make sure everybody notates is that you always want to make sure you have the latest firmware. And this is something that I preach up and down the road all day long. Make sure you have the latest firmware updated for the processors and the controller devices. Any firmware updates needed for Zigbee, for the Zigbee transceivers, the ZM24s, will be included in that device update itself. So make sure to do that. In terms of processors, it's very easy. You can click on Show Devices on the local network if the processor's on the network. And if that version number is in red, there's a new version of the firmware. Just click on that version number. It'll download the latest version as long as you're hooked into the network, into the internet, and you'll be able to upload it right away. In terms of the end devices, like the remotes, well, of course, you're going to need more often than not going to have to utilize the USB firmware version. So you'll want to check the firmware version against that's listed on the RTI control page. And as soon as you plug it in via USB, you click on that, it'll pull up what the latest firmware version is. You can go on rticontrol.com and be able to make sure that it is accurate, or up to date, excuse me. Okay, so always make sure you have the latest firmware, because if there is an update to the Zigbee transceiver built into the devices, it will be automatically updated to that. One pro tip for you, in terms of updating firmware on a processor, make sure that once the processor is fully booted up after the firmware update, that you do a full power cycle of the processor. It may sound like you're doing this twice, but you are. And here's why. If there is an update for firmware updates needed for the ZM24, that's what will trigger it. It's not the soft reset that the processor will do. It's going to be the full power cycle that needs to happen in order for that ZM24 to initiate that firmware update for it, or for the Zigbee transceiver to initiate that firmware update. All right, in terms of in the programming and software itself, once we've updated firmware and once we're getting all the devices added, we've built in our rooms, we've added our controllers into the mix, and we're going through the properties of that device and getting them all set up. Most of you will remember that under the remote properties themselves, as you can see at the T2X here in the properties window, as soon as I select this guy, it will bring up the device properties window. You're going to want to select the output tab and then make sure that you have two-way trigger codes for control systems. So this is the output going from that remote saying, I'm going to send these triggers over Zigbee to the parent control or to the parent Zigbee transceiver to initiate the macro to happen or the command to happen. Now, in order for feedback to happen, you need to make sure your two-way options, two-way transport is set for Zigbee. Now, there is an option for you to also select 802.11 if that device does have Wi-Fi. But in case of Zigbee, if you want to be able to receive that information over Zigbee, such as the title of the track or the volume level of a song, things of that nature, you'll want to utilize Zigbee no problem and be able to pull that data in. So you do have the option, but Zigbee is going to be very reliable, easy way to do it. The other part about this is that Zigbee, because it's such a low power, it's always on, it's always ready to go. So you don't have to wait for the device to reconnect to that Wi-Fi if it has gone into a power down or a standby setup. You'll get that instant feedback right away. So just keep those couple of things in mind as you're going through the setup of the remotes themselves. All right, so now that we've gotten the program all set up and we're getting ready to load it, in order for the Zigbee transceiver connected to the processor to load, what's going to happen is it's in terms of it getting all the information to be able to communicate, Integration Designer itself is going to create and provide the network ID, the encryption key, the RTI address from anywhere from 0 to 255, and determine the Zigbee router type and select the channel to base all the traffic load on. Integration Designer will do this. You don't have to go in and do any of this stuff. The coordinator parent will get this once the program is uploaded to that processor, and you'll be in good shape. For the remotes to get that information, well, they're going to get the same information as that main parent that it's assigned to. And with that, and that's going to include things like the network ID, the encryption, all that kind of stuff we just mentioned. For the extenders, however, you need that Zigbee Pro. Once again, why I implore you to make sure to buy that Zigbee Pro, because if you are going to be utilizing those ZM24s and adding them as extenders, in order for them to be able to get the accurate network information, the encryption key, all that kind of fun stuff, you need that Zigbee Pro to provide that information in the setup side of it. The other part about this, as I mentioned before, is that if you are going to be having remotes that are going to identify with an extender or a secondary Zigbee network, you need to power cycle those after the programming has been done nearest to that transceiver so that it can attach itself to it. So keep those couple things in mind. All right, judging the signal quality. The thing that a lot of people always have questions about, how do I know that this is working? How do I know that the program took? Well, on the ZM24, it's a pretty simple way to identify it. The green activity light at the top of the ZM24, if it's blinking, it means that it's receiving and transmitting the data. It's all good. If it's off, and this is a question that comes up all the time, people start to kind of go, well, hold on, is it working? Is it not? No, off just means that there's no data that transfer at the moment. This is about the activity, right? If it's blinking, that means something's happening. If it's off, there's just no activity right now, and that's okay. The red status light, however, if it's solid, it means it's powered up and it's been successfully programmed. If it's blinking, it's getting power, but it's attempting to make that connection. If you see that your ZM24 is constantly blinking or it can't seem to connect to a certain device, you may want to just power cycle that ZM24. You may want to check for that firmware update. You may want to resend that program file to the processor again, just to see if for some reason some of the information didn't get transferred, say the encryption key or whatever the case may be. Or is that the end device not close enough to be able to make that connection? So if it's blinking, is it tempting? If it's constantly blinking, that's when you need to check to see, am I in range? Are my devices in range? What's going on with it? In terms of the XP3, and I like to bring this one up because people say, well, these are a little different. There's status and then there's RF link, comparatively speaking, or compared to, say, the status and the activity light. So how do those decipher? Well, the green status light, if it's blinking, it means it's powered and booting up. If it's off, the upload's complete and you don't have to worry about anything. So it's uploaded the program, everything's good. So if it's blinking, powered up, it's getting all that information, and then once it goes off, you're in good shape. The red RF light link right here, if it's blinking, it's establishing that communication or that data transfer. It means that it's happening. It's communicating with whatever device. It's looking for that communication. It's established it, but it's also maybe transferring that data. So if it's blinking, it's fine. If for some reason it's not on, or if it's solid, that's when you're going to want to call tech support and say, here's what's going on. And they'll have some additional things that you can try. But just keep those in mind in terms of checking that transceiver connection on both those types of devices. Now, one of the easiest ways, and we mentioned this before, to test for the range of any sort of ZM24 or XP3 within a project is to utilize the RTI Zigbee Network Test Bundle. Now, what the Zigbee Network Test Bundle is or not even the bundle, the driver is a counter. It counts 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I'll show you this in a minute. And I'll show it to you right now here, really quick. So essentially what will happen is when you load this program in, we'll show you what this looks like. It'll start to just count. And with this counting, it's utilizing Zigbee to get those numbers. So it'll start to count 1, 2, or 80, 81, 82, depending on how far along the process is in the processor. And as that time goes on, you can walk around, and if that keeps ticking up, you're within range. But the minute it starts to skip numbers or jump numbers, you know, okay, I'm either on the verge of being outside of that range, or it's not getting the complete signal, or even more so, if it stops altogether, you know you're outside the signal. So that's a very simplistic way of explaining the Zigbee Network Test Bundle and the counter driver. And there's additional information that we'll show you about this driver here in just a minute. I want to bring up Integration Designer and show you exactly the easiest way to do this. With Integration Designer itself, you don't have to download a whole thing for it. In fact, there's a very easy way to be able to pull in Integration Designer and the Zigbee Network Test without actually having to go through a lot of extra steps. If you're working in a project like we are here, and I go up to Add Workspace Item window and pull in, go to my global and select my drivers, I can simply test Zigbee, and there's the Zigbee Network Test. So again, I went to Add Workspace Item, I selected the Drivers tab under Global in this case, and typed in Zigbee, and there's my Zigbee Network Test. And you'll see in here, it's a debug counter. It allows us to do exactly what that video just showed us, have that ticking going up. But here's what makes it so easy, is that we've included the sample file right here for you. And with Integration Designer 11, I can click on this and have it open up a completely new iteration of Integration Designer 11 that I can use. As you can see, 2 different versions. And there's my Zigbee signal test. And if I expand this out, there's the XP6 that I can convert to, say, an XP3 if I'm using an XP3 or an XP8V, whatever I might be using. And then you'll see that the controllers are already set up as well. If I were to click on the T2X as an example, it's already been set up with that Zigbee information. So there's my Zigbee test, as you saw on that video, that quick video we showed you. And here itself is a text-based a text box with the variable in it that is the current count of the Zigbee driver. So this is what's going to tick up. Very simple way to do this. We can load this into our system and be able to then, it'll start up ticking automatically, and we can walk around and test that signal. It's a very easy way to do that. The other part about this is that it does provide you a secondary frame on here to give you some additional diagnostics. And we'll go through what these look like here, or what these are in just a moment. But I want to show you that it's as simple as swiping from right to left or left to right, or pressing the advanced test frame 2 button right here. But the beauty of this, once again, is that it's not being necessarily put onto that project file. It's a different iteration. You're just testing that signal to make sure that you're in good shape. Now, once you've tested all this stuff out, there's another method for which you can test the signal, and that's through the XP diagnostic driver. And in the XP diagnostics driver itself, you will notice that there is a Zigbee tab. And under that Zigbee tab, you'll see there's our Zigbee coordinator, or the parent, and you'll see that the XP6S has quite a bit of information. We not only have the channel information, we have the firmware version right up top, which answers a lot of questions in terms of making sure that we're up to date. The other part is understanding what these different areas mean. So on this Zigbee tab, you'll want to check the current channel and make sure it isn't overlapping with any Wi-Fi channels. And we have a list of Zigbee and Wi-Fi channel overlap, and that can be found on the Zigbee documentation on the website as well. What channel 20 can typically overlap with the Wi-Fi channel. All that's on the RTI website for the Zigbee troubleshooting technical bulletin. The Zigbee coordinator will show statistics for the ZM24 to the XP processor or built-in transceivers of the XP3 or KX4. It will not show statistics from separate Zigbee networks set up with expansion processors, though. Keep in mind that this is only pulling diagnostic data from this one main processor. If you want to have that additional information from, say, an expansion processor with a secondary Zigbee network, you need to have another iteration of the XP diagnostic driver loaded onto that processor, that specific processor, in order to pull that specific data from that secondary network. So for those of you that are kind of saying, well, hold on, wait, what? What does that mean again? Which is okay. If I were going to add in an expansion processor into the mix and select the where's my XP3? There it is, XP3, and we'll just title this secondary. With that secondary network, what I can then do is I could actually, and having that processor, that secondary processor in here now, as a full expansion processor, I can add in that XP diagnostic driver, not once, but twice, for the main, right? So there's our XP diagnostic driver, and then I'm going to add it again once more into here. There's my number 2, and under that secondary process, or under that secondary iteration, if I go under the driver and then the driver properties, I change that then to the secondary XP3 processor. And now this XP diagnostics will pull data from that secondary XP3 processor. Keep in mind, you're still going to have to launch it from whatever what network connection is for that XP3, but you do have it available to you. And then the diagnostics driver, upon loading, will show you that specific data for that coordinator device as a secondary Zigbee network. Now, the end devices you'll see here, we have the T2X, and there's a whole boatload of data right here. So what does all this data mean? Well, first of all, the TX is the amount of the byte data count that's transmitted from the devices from the coordinator to the end device, and the end device to the coordinator. Same thing for the received bytes. And then you'll see the timestamp of the last information received. The RSSI is the receiver signal strength indicator. And this is a very important one to take a look at here, as well as on that on the device itself with the counter. The receiver signal strength indicator is a measurement of how strong the signal is between the coordinator, the ZM24, and that end device remote. The idea value range for normal operation is going to be anywhere from -30 to -85 is going to be that normal operating range. Now, -30 means that it's closer in distance between the two devices, the coordinator and the end device. The -85, on the other hand, means that they're further in terms of distance and the signal strength is further apart. The LQI represents link quality index, and this is an indication of the quality and the strength of the signal between the coordinator and the end device. And these values range anywhere from 0 to 255. So you might say, well, that's quite the value range. Where, what's okay? What's the ideal range? The best range to be at is anywhere from 200 to 255. Those are generally going to be your safe bets. If you're not in that range, if you're a little bit lower, like 180, 190, it might be okay. But to try to get into that 200, 250, which means that you may have to put an extender, you may have to put it closer, you may have to change the placement, you may have to take into account any sort of interference areas. But that 250 or 200 to 255 is going to be a good all-around range to be in. As I mentioned before, the LQI and the RSSI are both found on the counter driver page on the remote. And I'll show you where that is here in just a second. And I've got a little hint for you on that as well. The packets is the amount of packet information that is sent between the two devices. And then you'll see this gray activity button. And when this is gray, it just means that nothing is happening, just like we talked about with the status lights, but it'll blink green and go back to gray when there's no activity. Now, in terms of the log, how can we use the log to show that information? Well, if we go to the log, it's very important to see that you'll notice as I was pressing the buttons over here, that the button down, as an example, when I press the button, change the event to button and selected high, it's going to give me information saying the device T2X transport method was Zigbee. So that means I have it set up. It sent it, and then the button went down, Zigbee. So I'm getting that information here, assuring me that the transport method is correct. I did set it up correctly. It is sending it, and I am receiving, or in that it is being sent and received correctly. Because remember, this is the diagnosis for the XP6, so it's reading what the information is. If it didn't get this, well, obviously it wouldn't come up here, and thus it wouldn't have worked right. So it's a great way to be able to show what happens on a simple button push, and that the communication is correct. Now, in terms of the counter driver and trying to remember some of that information that we talked about in terms of the LQI and the RSSI, here's what I would recommend you do. We'll jump back here to the T2X here. And what I would recommend you do is go over to frame 2. And in frame 2, under this RSSI, put that range that we talked about underneath here. And then you can save this and use this program file again and again, but you'll have that range in there at least. So what you can simply do, right click on it, edit the text, click the edit text button, hit enter, and then put ideal range or RSSI is going to be -30 to -85. And then at least it'll be listed on that device, and whoever, if you have an employee that's doing this, they can know, okay, this is the ideal range I need to shoot for. And the same thing for the LQI, or the link quality. We can just simply go into the edit text by right clicking on that button, hit the enter button and say ideal range 200 to 255. Press OK, and now I know. And when this comes up, it would show that range itself, what it's in, and then whomever is installing this would have an idea. So it's a very easy way to have that information in there and be able to help your employees out if they're going through and doing these diagnostics, as they should, during the process of setup, and well, even in quotation or in the quoting part and the walkthrough, taking that XP3 or that XP6S, plugging in the transceiver, plugging in the Zigbee network test bundle into the mix, and then setting it up where they think the primary is going to be, and then doing the test. They can test all this information and be able to make sure that the signal is ideal. So really, Zigbee is a very an extremely effective communication protocol once set up properly, and is the primary communication method for RTI XP processors and remotes. And we discussed what Zigbee is and how it works, the proper setup and programming method, the tools to be able to utilize the Zigbee network test counter and the XP diagnostics to ensure successful installation. If you have any additional questions in regards to this, I recommend you go onto the RTI website, rticontrol.com. We have a lot of information about the Zigbee and setting it up on the Integration Designer 11 user manual, but you can always go to the Zigbee installation and troubleshooting tech bulletin on the website as well, and be able to get additional information about what you may or may not have known about Zigbee and troubleshooting it out. And don't hesitate to reach out to your regional sales engineer, sales manager for additional information. And please don't forget to purchase your Zigbee Pro today. Hopefully you got a lot of great information here today, gave you an idea of what Zigbee is, how, oh, thank you. It says puche. I meant to say purchase, I apologize, but thank you for catching my error, Michael. Don't forget to purchase your Zigbee Pro today. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. Go ahead and post them. And any questions that you may have in the question section of the software here. I'm going to open that up right now and see if there's any in there. And if you do, please put them in, and we'll be happy to answer them. Other than that, thanks so much for your attention and joining us here today. We look forward to working with you in the future. Have a great one, everybody.